Good afternoon to our listeners on Parliament Radio 105.5 FM, our viewers on the Parliament channel, and those of you joining us on the World Wide Web via the Parliament's website www.ttparliament.org and via our YouTube channel ParlView. We welcome you to our coverage of today's sitting of the Senate. It is Monday, May 15th, 2017. Finance variation of Appropriation Financial Year 27 Bill 2017, which was passed in the House of Representatives on May 12th, will be read the first time in the name of the Ministry of Finance. There are 2 papers to be laid. There are 3 urgent questions and 5 questions which qualify for oral answer, and debate is expected on the Finance Variation of Appropriation Bill, which was introduced. We take you over now to the chamber. We welcome you to the 21st sitting of the Senate in the second session of the 11th Parliament that takes place on Monday, May 15th, 2017.
Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as the Supreme Being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations, so that setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and the prosperity of our nation. Amen.
Oath or affirmation, announcements by the President.
Honorable Senators, I have granted leave of absence to Senator Daniel Solomon, who is out of the country. Honorable Senators, I have received the following correspondence from His Excellency the President Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, ORTTSC. The Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Appointment of a temporary senator by His Excellency Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, ORTTSC, President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. To Ms. Chrislyn Moore. Whereas Senator Daniel Solomon is incapable of performing his duties as a senator by reason of his absence from Trinidad and Tobago. Now, therefore, I, Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, President, as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(a) and Section 44(4)(b) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, acting in accordance with the advice of the Leader of the Opposition, do hereby appoint you, Chrislyn Moore, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 15th of May 2017 and continuing during the absence from Trinidad and Tobago of the said Senator Daniel Solomon. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of St. Anne's this 15th day of May 2017. Honorable Senators, a senator is required to take the oath.
I, Chrislyn Moore, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, and will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
Honorable Senators, as you are aware, former Senator and Minister Mr. Rennie Dumas passed away on Sunday, May the 14th, 2017. I now invite you to offer tributes. Leader of Government Business.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, it is with the deepest regret and sadness that I rise to pay tribute to a former colleague, friend, and in PNM terms, a true soldier in the Red Army, Mr. Rennie Dumas, a.k.a. Stretch. His death, Madam President, means something very personal to me, because both of us became ill around the same time in December of last year. I recall vividly, immediately after my surgery, a couple of days after, when the Prime Minister visited me at the hospital, he indicated to me that, boy, Stretch suffered a stroke. And since then, Madam President, I have been getting almost weekly update of his health from Auntie Joan, whom I call the mother of the PNM. Madam President, Trinidad and Tobago, and in particular, the people of Tobago, has lost a true patriot, a hard-working and dedicated public servant, and a Tobagonian to his heart. Mr. Dumas and I served in the Manning Cabinet when he was Minister of Public Utilities and later Minister of Local Government. After the 2007 election, he was appointed Minister of Labour, Small and Micro Enterprises. The parliamentary document outlines in some detail his career, but I will just go through his ministerial responsibilities. Minister of Labour, Small and Micro Enterprise Development from November 2007 to May 2010. Minister of Local Government from November 2003 to November 2007. Minister of Public Utilities and the Environment, October 2002 to November 2003. Minister of State in the Office of the Prime Minister, December 2001 to October 2002. He was an opposition senator from January 2001 to October 2001. And then he became the Member of Parliament for Tobago East in 2007 to 2010. Madam President, as a minister, an MP, and a senator, he was clear and articulate and had an organized and an analytical mind. And I must say he performed creditably in all the various portfolios that he held. And in particular, when I joined this government in 2015, and I was given the portfolio of Minister of Rural Development and Local Government, where we championed the local government reform process. Mr. Dumas was very instrumental in assisting me in that exercise. But, Madam President, my closest association with him was through the party. He served as Education Officer and Research Officer of the Tobago Council of the PNM. He was the Tobago's representative on the General Council of the People's National Movement. He was one of the more influential voices in the PNM changing its constitution which resulted in the formation of the Tobago Council of the PNM, the single act that has caused us to rebound in the politics of Tobago, so that today we are an extremely strong force on our sister island. He was elected Member of Parliament for Tobago East in 2007. He played a critical role in all THA elections. And I must say today that probably bar of London, he's one of the most influential persons responsible for the current strength of the PNM in the island of Tobago. In the last couple of years, he played a leading role in the drafting of the policy of Tobago's autonomy and full internal self-government. He even went ahead and became the campaign manager for Ms. Ayanna Webster Roy, who successfully contested the election in Tobago East and won. Whenever called to serve, in whatever capacity, big or small, in front or from behind, he was always willing, a true servant of the people. On behalf of the government of Trinidad and Tobago, the members of this side of the Senate, and on behalf of the PNM family, I extend my deepest condolences to his family and friends, especially his wife and children, to the people of Tobago, and in particular, the people of Tobago East. May his soul rest in eternal peace.
Senator Moore.
It is with great regret that I offer my condolences to the family of the deceased, Mr. Dumas. This regret is really heartfelt because he was a family friend. In fact, his friendship crystallized through his relationship with my father. They were inseparable for a number of years. They were cronies, they were best friends, they were partners, they were confidants, and I would bump into them in the oddest of places. They were inseparable for a time before my father had his own stroke, and Mr. Dumas' Stretch became a real helper. The people of Plymouth, Tobago offer their condolences because their relationship with Rennie Dumas was much more personal. He was a son of that community, a member of the Men of Exile, Raffoul, Stretch. He was one of ours. He could be found at village watering holes and at community activities in Plymouth and across the island. My last encounter with Rennie was at a political meeting that my party held in Plymouth, and he attended. He would attend all my political meetings held in that constituency out of respect for the relationship that he had with my father and out of our long-standing relationship. He would always stay to offer words of encouragement and advice and to give me a hug and to share some moment of levity. Rennie Dumas, in the last months of his life, really experienced a reality that was different. He suffered great hardship. Great personal hardship befell him, and he appeared to be alone. Personal hardship, madam, is not a stranger to any of us. And it is in these times where we are stretched that indeed we seek the comfort of Almighty God and the comfort of our friends and our family. When Rennie Dumas found himself at the feet of hardship, his friends and family, his true friends and his real family, was there to support him, to anoint him, to pray for him, and to minister to him. On behalf of the people of Plymouth, on behalf of the people of Tobago, on behalf of the Tobago Forwards, and on behalf of my own family, I offer sincerest condolences for the great loss to the community of Plymouth and the people of Tobago and the passing of Rennie Dumas. May his soul rest in peace, and may he be received into the company of angels.
Senator Small.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The independent bench learned with deep sadness on the passing of the former Member of Parliament, Senator and Minister Rennie Dumas. He served the people of Trinidad and Tobago with distinction in these various capacities for just over a decade. With the passing of Stretch, as he's affectionately known, and I want to share that, when he was Minister of Labour, the ministry to which I was attached, Minister of Energy, we shared the same building, a building that's down the street there. And because we shared the same building, and we would always meet each other at events throughout the ministry. And he was always known as one of the most affable ministers that we had at that time. So while his passing evokes a sense of sadness and loss, it's also a celebration of his legacy of selflessness and self-sacrifice for the greater good. This is a great loss for us all, as we are left without an individual dedicated to the advancement of Trinidad and Tobago, an individual who was actively engaged in the building and development and advancement of our country. In honor of this remarkable political stalwart and the legacy he leaves behind, we urge all of us to be cognizant of his triumph through struggle, and that he was one of the more understated persons of his generation, but he dedicated his life to the bringing about meaningful change. On behalf of the members of the independent bench and all of our families, I would like to offer our sincerest condolences to the family of the late Rennie Dumas in this time of great sadness, and pray for God's comfort upon them. May his immortal memory and the fact that he is in the great beyond be a source of comfort to them, even though they mourn his untimely passing. Thank you, Madam President.
Honourable Senators, I wish to join with the previous speakers here today in expressing sympathy and condolences to the family of Rennie Dumas. I also wish to endorse what has been said about him. Rennie Dumas was more than a parliamentarian to me. He was a friend. And while that friendship began as a result of politics and our starting our parliamentary life together as opposition senators in 2001, it continued beyond politics in 2010 when he ceased being a member of Parliament. Everyone hears about the harshness of political life and the few friendships that endure. I am certainly happy that ours did. Rennie Dumas had an innate wisdom and understanding of human nature and how the world operates. That trait in and of itself made him an excellent politician and an extremely effective minister. He was always prepared to speak in Parliament on any topic, sometimes at a moment's notice. And what a speaker he was. Many of us will remember his booming voice and towering presence in both this chamber and the other place. Many of us will also remember his love and passion for Tobago, which were limitless. It is with more than mere passing melancholy that one observes that we seem to be paying tribute to deceased former members of Parliament quite often these days. We mourn every such loss as we do this one. I once again join in paying tribute to Rennie Dumas and in thanking him for his service to Trinidad and Tobago. May his soul rest in peace. Honourable Senators, I will instruct the Clerk of the Senate, to convey to his family the sentiments that we have expressed here today. And Honourable Senators, I now ask that we observe a minute of silence. Please be seated.
Bills brought from the House of Representatives, the Finance Variation of Appropriation Financial Year 2017 Bill 2017, in the name of the Minister of Finance.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. In accordance with Standing Order 621B, I beg to move that the next stage of the Finance Variation of Appropriation Financial Year 2017 Bill 2017 be taken later in the proceedings.
Honorable Senators, the question is that the next stage of the Finance Variation of Appropriation Financial Year 2017, Bill 2017, be taken later in the proceedings. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. The next stage of the bill will be taken later in the proceedings.
Petitions, papers.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers listed on the order paper in my name. The annual report of the First Citizens Asset Management Limited for the year 2016.
Government business.
Madam President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following paper as listed on the order paper in the name of the Minister of Public Utilities. The annual administrative report of the National Maintenance, Training and Security Company Limited, MTS, for the year ended December 31st, 2015.
Reports from committees, urgent questions.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. To the Honorable Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, what immediate measures are being taken to address claims contained in the 2016 International Narcotics Control Strategy Report that Trinidad and Tobago is a money laundering jurisdiction?
Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, you have 2 minutes.
Madam President, the 2017 International Narcotics Control Strategy Report is an annual report by the United States Department of State to the U.S. Congress, which is prepared in accordance with the Foreign Assistance Act. The reference report, released in March of this year, outlines the efforts of countries with respect to initiatives against all aspects of the international drug trade in the calendar year 2016. The report comprises 2 volumes. Volume 1 deals with drug and chemical control, while Volume 2 deals with money laundering and financial crimes. Information available indicates that Trinidad and Tobago is currently non-compliant with the Global Forum standard for the exchange of information on request for tax purposes. Trinidad and Tobago has committed to the new global standard for the exchange of information for tax purposes and to commence the exchange of information according to the new standard by 2017. In an effort to improve Trinidad and Tobago's current Global Forum rating, a number of actions were undertaken. In January of this year, Global Forum's approval was obtained to defer Trinidad and Tobago's commitment to commence exchanging information automatically in accordance with the new standard from 2017 to 2018. On April the 7th of this year, Trinidad and Tobago applied to the Global Forum's fast-track procedure and also requested to become party to the Multilateral Convention on Mutual Assistance in Tax Matters, and intends to become party to the Multilateral Competent Authority Agreement.
Your time is up.
Thank you very much.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, could the Honorable Minister indicate whether this action by the United States will impact in any negative way on any assistance to this country in its fight against money laundering?
Minister.
Thank you very much. We have no such indication. Thank you very much.
Madam President, could the Honourable Minister indicate how soon action will be taken to address this matter as it relates to the image of Trinidad and Tobago within CARICOM and within the international community?
Minister.
Madam President, we continue persevering in maintaining the deep and strong ties that bind the United States of America and our country, and as feasible, we would seek to meet our obligations in this regard.
Senator Mark, next question.
To the Honourable Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries. In light of the invasion of locusts in several communities in South Trinidad, can the Minister state what urgent measures are being employed to address this problem?
Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Madam President, I thank Senator Mark for his timely intervention. Madam President, the current problems being experienced with the locusts in Moruga comes after a few infestations we've had in the past, the worst being in 2004, and more recently in October 2014 in Cedras, June, July 2014 in Chatham, and 2016 September in Point Fortin. There are two ways in which we approach any locust invasion. It's a seasonal thing, and one is proactive and one is reactive. The locusts have a particular nesting season, which is in the last quarter of the year, September to December. So when we responded in September in Point Fortin, it was to deal with the locusts appearing for the purposes of nesting. Thereafter, it's mainly reactive to deal with the offspring from the nesting period. And we've had a particularly intense problem in Moruga. We've responded by putting in place more resources in terms of labor, chemicals, equipment. In the last month, the ministry has provided an additional 7 mist blowers, and we've introduced 2 cannon sprayers to deal with the low-flying locusts. And we've seen the results in most areas. We've divided the Moruga area into 24 areas. We've indicated which of those areas have high and which have low infestations, and I believe that the ministry is working to deal with the issue. We recognize that in a few areas, 5 areas, the infestation remains high, and we focused on that in the last 2 weeks and would continue to deal with the matter. Thank you.
Senator Mark.
Could the Honourable Minister indicate, Madam President, how is this invasion or infestation, as he referred to it, affecting social and agricultural life in the communities that you have identified, 5 communities or areas?
Minister of Agriculture.
Madam President, the locust is a pest. It's destructive to the farmers. We've seen the signs of the damage on some of the farms, and it's of course something that will affect social life and community life in the areas which are affected. In fact, in dealing with the locusts, we also have to be careful that we do not overspray. We do not spray in a manner that would interfere with other forms of activity, including beekeeping. So it is a fact. It would interfere with agricultural production and the lives of the community.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, could the Honourable Minister indicate whether the government is considering providing any compensation to farmers in particular who would have suffered enormous losses as a result of this infestation?
Minister of Agriculture.
Madam President, it is not the policy of this government or previous governments to compensate on the basis of something like the locust or similar pests. But as far as possible, the ministry would ensure that the farmers who are affected are provided as much support as we could provide.
Senator Mark, next question.
To the Honorable Minister of Health. In light of the Minister's admission that questionable drugs have been used in the CDAP program over the past few years, what measures are being taken by the ministry to remove and replace these drugs from the shelves of pharmacies?
Minister of Health.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, first let me say that the CDAP program is an excellent program that needs to be lauded and supported. At no time did the Minister of Health, myself, make any statement that CDAP drugs are not good. That was a headline in a newspaper, which was a total misrepresentation of what I said in the lower house. At no time did I make a blanket statement, and my Hansard will bear it out, that CDAP drugs are not good. What I said was that we are looking at two categories of drugs to treat hypertension and diabetes, where the efficacy of these drugs, the anecdotal evidence over the years suggests that they may not be working as well as they should. What I also said is that we may have some factual basis to support that. The drugs are not unsafe, they are safe. What we are looking at is their efficacy. Let me further state that since I have started to talk in the public domain about drug procurement as a whole, patients and doctors are coming to me in droves and saying for the first time there is a minister willing to stand up for what is right for the citizens of this country as far as drug procurement is concerned. For too long, drug procurement has not revolved around the patient, but has revolved around other interests. And it is this administration, starting with this year's procurement cycle, that for the first time in many a year, we are going to put the patient and the voiceless patient at the center of our procurement cycle.
Honourable Senators, before I allow Senator Mark to ask his supplementary questions, the time has expired for urgent questions. So with your leave, we will just allow Senator Mark his 2 questions. Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. Through you, Madam President, could the Honourable Minister provide the Senate as to when he speaks to the efficacy of these 2 drugs, Madam President, could he indicate to us what steps or measures are being taken to either replace or remove those drugs, given the fact the strength of those drugs do not carry what you would really be satisfied with as the Honourable Minister of Health?
Minister of Health.
Madam Speaker, what I can tell you in speaking to about 10 physicians to date, what they have been doing over the years is simply increasing the dosage so that they get the bioequivalent dose of the drug. What we want to do with this procurement cycle is to make sure that every drug on our formulary every generic is bioequivalent to their brand names. And let me go on record again as saying I have nothing against generic drugs. There are good generic drugs and they are not so good. Same way there are good branded drugs and not so good. But we must ensure that in our public system, that a drug procurement process is robust enough so that we can guarantee our patients a safe, reliable, predictable supply of drugs throughout the year. One of the other things we are doing, Madam Speaker, for the first time, one of the biggest problems in drug procurement is coming down to the last quarter of any financial year, where NIBDEC may have no guarantee of funding to place orders, and NIBDEC has to wait until the start of the other financial year. We are now fixing that, so NIBDEC could start to place orders in the last quarter of the financial year. So it's a whole revolution in the way we procure drugs.
Senator Mark.
In this revolution in procuring drugs, Honourable Minister, would you share with us whether the source of the importation of those drugs that you have mentioned would be reviewed by your ministry to ensure the efficacy is addressed?
Minister of Health.
Yes. Madam Speaker, not only the source of those 2 drugs to treat hypertension and diabetes, but we are reviewing every single drug on the formulary. Because we have noticed in recent years, drugs have come into the formulary, to the national formulary, that have no right to be there. I was amazed recently in looking at an ad on American cable TV, and I saw a law firm put out an ad asking Americans to call them to sue a particular drug maker. And I said, but that drug sounds familiar. It's on our national formulary. And we are going to be taking away those branded drugs too, that have no right to be on a national formulary. So we are reviewing the entire process to guarantee our patients and our physicians who are backing me in this process, because physicians are actually saying, Minister, for the first time, we have a Minister of Health saying what we have been silently saying for years, but their voices have been stymied. So I give this honorable House and the country by extension that our drug procurement process is going to be radically altered to benefit the patients of Trinidad and Tobago.
Questions on notice, questions for oral answer.
Madam President, the government is proud to say that we will be answering all questions listed, save and except question number 73, which we ask for a 2-week deferral.
Question number 73 is deferred for 2 weeks. Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. Question number 51 to the Honourable Minister of Labour and Small Enterprise Development.
Minister of Labour and Small Enterprise Development.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, the growth and development of the cooperative movement in Trinidad and Tobago is really one of the priority areas of work in the Ministry of Labour and Small Enterprise Development. This is coupled with the reform of labour and related legislation, which is aimed at creating a more conducive, enabling environment for the promotion of decent work for all and the creation of sustainable enterprise and cooperatives. To this end, Madam President, the first consultative process in which I engaged in when I became the minister responsible for this portfolio was a consultation with the cooperative movement. These consultations were aimed at obtaining inputs into a national policy on cooperatives that would inform legislative amendments to govern the cooperative movement in Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, there were consultations held on January the 13th and 14th in Trinidad and January the 29th in Tobago. A wide cross-section of representatives from the cooperative movement, including the Cooperative Credit Union League of Trinidad and Tobago, participated in these consultations. The views and perspectives shared at the consultations informed the preparation of a first draft of the National Policy on Cooperatives, which was disseminated to stakeholders on June 29, 2016, with an initial deadline of July 29, 2016, for the submission of comments to the Ministry of Labour. It should be noted that the Cooperative Credit Union League of Trinidad and Tobago, on behalf of the credit union movement, requested an extension of time to August 30, 2016, to submit its comments on the first draft of the policy, and this request was granted. The deadline was subsequently extended to September 30, 2016 for submission of comments by all stakeholders. The submission of the Cooperative Credit Union League was received on September 16, 2016. Madam President, taking into account the many comments and views received on the first draft on the National Policy on Cooperatives, the Ministry undertook a careful and extensive review of all the positions expressed and sought and develop a second draft of the policy, which was disseminated again to stakeholders on the 31st of January 2017. The deadline given to all stakeholders, including the Cooperative Credit Union League, for the submission of comments on the second draft was February 15, 2017. I would have placed the League on notice to expect the second draft of the policy when I addressed them at a Thanksgiving service and launch of their calendar of events on January 21st, 2017. I also indicated at that event the time frame for the submission of comments on the second draft. Madam President, unfortunately, my statements at that event and intentions were grossly misrepresented in one of our daily newspapers, the Newsday, which stated that I had given the president of the Cooperative Credit Union League 14 days to comment on a revised and contentious version of the Credit Union and Cooperative Bills of 2014. As a consequence, therefore, I penned a correspondence to the editor and editor-in-chief of the newspaper, conveying my concerns over the inaccurate report. Permit me to clarify that we have not yet reached the stage of legislation at this time, Madam President, as was indicated in the Newsday article. But we are rather focusing on ensuring that the national policy on cooperatives, which will guide legislative amendments, are finalized and approved by Cabinet, so that the 14-day time frame that was given to stakeholders was meant for the second round of consultation. Madam President, my approach as the minister responsible for this portfolio has been to afford every opportunity for genuine consultation with all stakeholders.
Minister, your time is up. Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. Could the Honourable Minister indicate to this House whether the stakeholders have all responded to the second draft of the national policy on cooperatives? Madam President.
Minister.
Yes, thank you, Madam President. Indeed, I'm quite happy, Senator Mark, to share with you, the rest of the Senate and the rest of the country, that all the comments and views submitted have been collated into the draft policy, and it is now before Cabinet for its consideration, and I hope we'll have a decision soon. In that context, Madam President, I wish to expressly thank all the stakeholders who participated in that consultative process. And I also would like to thank the Commissioner of Cooperatives and his staff and the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Labour and Small Enterprise Development and our hard-working team at the Ministry for working assiduously in crafting this document.
Senator Mark.
President, could the Honourable Minister indicate once Cabinet has approved the policy on the cooperatives, that policy would be laid in the Parliament?
Minister.
Madam President, I cannot prejudge what the Cabinet is likely to do or don't do, but in terms of the question asked, such a policy will find its way before the Parliament, but I can't say yes, it will, or no, it will not, because it's a national policy.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, I don't know if the Minister is in a position to answer this question, but there has been some contention for some time as it relates to where to place the cooperative movement in this country. And I know the final position was that it should come under the control and supervision of the central bank. Can the Honourable Minister share with us whether that is the route that is being taken by the government in relation to ensuring the financial integrity and stability of this vital cooperative body.
Minister.
Thank you, Madam President. And indeed, I understand the anxiety of Senator Mark, but I just want to point out to this House that the contentiousness which existed with regards to this particular issue did not occur under this administration. The contention lied under the last administration that I worked assiduously for months, Madam President, to bring all the stakeholders together to make sure all hands were on deck. And I am quite sure, following the Cabinet's decision, I will report here what the Cabinet has decided. So I'll report in due course.
Senator Ma.
Madam President, am I to infer from what the Honourable Minister has said that all cooperatives, credit union inclusive, will fall under central bank supervision and management when the new policy is enunciated?
Senator Mark, I won't allow that question.
You won't allow that? Okay.
Next question.
Question number 52 to the Honourable Minister of National Security.
Minister of National Security.
Thank you, Madam President. Honourable members, official data received from the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service indicate that for the 30 days of 2017, 52 murders were recorded and not 54, as stated in the question posed by Senator Mark. Of this number, 7 or 13.5% were solved as of January 31st, 2017.
Senator Ma.
Madam President, thank you. Could the Honourable Minister indicate to us what actions are being taken by his ministry and the government to provide more resources to the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service to address this low detection rate in the murder rate as you have identified?
Minister of National Security.
Madam President, the government continue to work together with the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service to increase the number of crime scene investigators, to expose them to a number of training institutions, both locally and abroad. Additionally, the Commissioner of Police has in fact taken particular interest in the detection. You'll also recognize that part of the strategic pillar is in fact detection. And so we are working together with the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service to improve the detection rate as quickly and as fast as possible, Madam President.
Senator Ma.
Madam President, today is the 15th of May. I would like to ask the Honourable Minister whether the detection rate identified a short while ago, whether there has been any improvement since the period January, or the information you provided a short while ago, would that be inclusive of today's date, that percentage of detection was in fact realized, given the 52 murders? Madam President, you understand the point I'm making?
Yes, I have to tell you that it doesn't arise from the answer that was given by the minister.
No, I'm just asking the Honourable Minister, Madam President, whether the detection rate
Yes.
since then to now has increased.
Minister of National Security.
Madam President, the detection rate as it stands to date is about 18%. Right now, 18% as of today.
Senator Mark, question. Next question.
Yeah, just a supplemental, Madam President. Yeah, this is my. Yeah. I thought I'm entitled to 4. I think I asked 2. Oh, 4. Okay, sorry. Madam President, I just wanted to ask the Honourable Minister whether the 18% identified, is it for crime generally, or is it in murders alone? Yes, murders alone. All right, thank you very much.
You may have one more supplementary. If you...
I reserve that for the next round.
Next round.
Thank you.
Next question, Senator Mark.
Thank you. Question number 61 to the Honourable Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, the National Gas Company of Trinidad and Tobago Limited, the NGC, has advised that it did not cut the supply of natural gas to any or all of Methanol Holdings Trinidad Limited, MHTL, plants during the period May 1st, 2016 to June 30th, 2016, with or without MHTL's consent. MHTL's 3-monthly interim contract had expired, and there was no commercial and or legal basis for a gas supply. All 3 substantive MHTL contracts had previously expired way back in 2013 and 2015 respectively. In the circumstances, the affected MHTL plants were brought down by MHTL with NGC support in an orderly manner.
Senator.
If I may ask the Minister, this same MHTL did pursue legal action against the NGC for breach of contract. Against that decision and action of MHTL, would not the Minister agree that there would have been some kind of activity that would have caused that legal action on the part of this particular company?
Minister.
Not really, Madam President. Madam President, that matter is being currently negotiated outside of the legal process, and we hope to have a commercial settlement to that matter. However, since the plans were brought down in an orderly manner, the NGC has established an interim agreement which will end in June and which they hope to extend until the end of the year, whereby MHTL will receive 164 million cubic feet of gas per day, and they will decide what plants they want to put it to use it on. So as we speak, 2 or 3 of those 4 plants that were brought down are back on stream.
Madam President, through you, could the Honourable Minister indicate what capacity in terms of operation these plants are at? Are they operating at a 100% capacity, 70%? Could you advise us?
Minister of Energy.
I'm not sure of the exact capacity, but I could take the liberty to say M5000 is operating at full capacity. The other plant, Methanol 4, I think is almost at full capacity. The other 3 plants are under capacity, but as you know, there is something called gas curtailment, which I will deal with extensively during my presentation later today.
Senator Mark.
President, could the Honourable Minister indicate whether with the Juniper gas field coming on stream shortly to supply close to 1.5 trillion cubic feet, I think about 530 cubic feet per day, could the Honourable Minister indicate whether that is on stream, and when that does happen, these plants of MHTL will all be able to get their supply of gas to operate at 100% capacity?
Senator Mark, that question doesn't arise.
Oh, it does not arise. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to get stuff clarification.
Senator Richards.
Thank you, Madam President. Question number 72 to the Minister of Planning and Development.
Minister of Planning and Development.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, the Town and Country Planning Division makes a direct effort to ensure that all new developments for commercial and office use in Trinidad and Tobago provide access for the differently abled in accordance with fundamental principles set out by the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards, National Standards, TTS, /ANSI, ICC, A117.1, 2014, accessible and usable buildings and facilities. The division incorporates these considerations into its development control operations by incorporating relevant requirements into permissions for development of land.
Madam President, there are two types of planning applications, namely an outline and a full or final application. Sorry. An outline application allows for a decision on the general principles on how a site or a building can be developed. A full or final planning permission allows for a decision on the detailed proposal of how a site or building can be developed. The full grant of planning permission does not in itself enable development to commence. There are other legal consents and procedural requirements to be considered prior to the issuance of a completion certificate by the relevant authority. In this context, Madam President, attention is drawn to the applicant of the need to comply with all other statutory provisions, such as those contained in the Building Regulations and Public Health Act, Fire Regulations, and the OSH Act. These are stated in the notice of the grant of planning permission to develop land as conditional notes. Conditions in the grant of outlying planning permission that speak directly to access for the disabled include the following. 1, all new development must have access for persons with disabilities and those who are mobility impaired incorporated into the design of buildings as an integral part of the proposal. Example, washroom in public buildings should be designed for wheelchair access, electronic access doors, ramps, and the like. 2, parking bays for persons with disabilities must be located as close as possible to the entrance of buildings or premises and must be clearly visible with signs posted and marked with the relevant international symbol. Madam President, the Ministry of Public Administration document titled Government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago Office Outfitting Policy outlines the requirements and standards related to these planning designs and fit out of offices for the Government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. It also relates to privately owned buildings leased for the office accommodation by the state. The Property and Real Estate Services Division of the Ministry of Public Administration, is responsible for the administration and property management services for all structures being used for public purposes. And as a requirement, they confirm that all aspects of any building proposed for government use is in compliance. The assessment that they use is based on the informed reports of multiple agencies, including the OSH Authority, as it relates to any building's degree of compliance with the OSH requirements. As a requirement, Madam President, all agencies, both public or privately owned, must adhere to the regulations laid out in the OSH Act number 1 of 2004, as amended in 2006. Regulations, standards, best practices, and codes of practice are also applicable. This policy ensures compliance with the relevant clauses of the OSH Act, and perusal of the Act reveals that there is no direct provision on access for the differently able.
Minister, your time is up.
Thank you, Madam.
Senator Richards.
Thank you, Madam President. Through you, thank you, Minister, for that comprehensive answer. Through you once again, the Minister referenced new buildings and requirements for same. Can the Minister indicate whether the Ministry has done an assessment of buildings that may be older, that may have been retrofitted to accommodate for the differently abled, or there's a schedule for retrofitting of these?
Minister.
Thank you very kindly, Madam President. Madam President, the Ministry of Planning and Development has done an assessment in particular of buildings for older persons, which will entail an assessment of whether they have been retrofitted to suit persons who are differently abled, and the assessment continues. We have done specifically those homes for the elderly, and we're in the process of doing other buildings which may not have been captured. And we are in the process of doing that, Madam President.
Senator Richards.
Minister, is there a timeline? Can the Minister indicate if there's a timeline, given the length of time the OSHA Act has been implemented, for the retrofitting of those buildings and the completion of the assessment?
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, with regard to the homes for the elderly, all homes have been examined. With regard to other buildings, we are still in the process of doing that, and it is anticipated that by 2018 we should have covered all buildings.
Thank you, Madam President. Finally, and I don't know if this falls within the Minister's remit, has the Ministry also done an assessment of the state facilities, in addition to access, where technological aids have been provided for those persons who are differently abled, sight impaired, hearing impaired, etc.? For example, libraries.
Minister.
Thank you. No, we have not, Madam President.
Senator Roach.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. Can the Minister please answer what, if anything, is being done to make present Parliament compliant with disability access?
Minister.
Madam President, the Parliament is in the process of examining the what is available now. I know they have put some ramps in place, but a lot more needs to be done. And Madam President, having brought this to my attention, I will ensure that the Parliament moves assiduously to have it done.
Thank you. Thank you,
Senator Amin.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to ask the Minister if there are any efforts from the Ministry of Planning to work with agencies or bodies representative of the differently abled to standardize the designs, the measurements, and so on that you described earlier, so that just as there are OSH specifications that OSHA supervises, if there such a similar thing would be done for the differently abled fittings.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, as I indicated, when the Ministry of Planning and Development gives the approval, those specifications are stated in the approval to ensure that there is compliance with the approval that is given.
Madam President, I'd like to inform this House and yourself that the government is in a position to answer question number 73.
Honourable Senators, I will therefore reverse the previous order that I had made. Senator Richards.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and thank you to the Minister of Planning for the answers to those questions. Question number 73 to the Minister of Social Development and Family Services.
Minister of Social Development and Family Services.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, senior citizens' homes are currently governed by the Private Hospital Act, and this is within the remit of the Ministry of Health. On September 7, 2007, however, the Homes for Older Persons Act was assented to, and the Homes for Older Persons Regulations subsequently passed in 2009 by Parliament. The Homes for Older Persons Act will provide for the licensing, regulation, and control of homes for older persons in Trinidad and Tobago, and upon proclamation, the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services will be responsible for the functions enshrined therein. The Division of Aging in the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, in view of its mandate, the proposed Homes for Older Persons Act, and recognizing some of the limitations of the Private Hospitals Act as it relates to homes for older persons, has been performing some of the functions stated in the Homes for Older Persons Act. In this regard, the Division of Aging has assessed 100 of the 187 senior citizen homes in Trinidad and Tobago in accordance with the standards of care and management standards outlined in the Homes for Older Persons Regulation. This approach was implemented to, 1, compensate for the shortfalls in the implementation of the Private Hospitals Act, and 2, to prepare senior citizens homeowners for what would be required for compliance with the Homes for Older Persons legislation when it is proclaimed and enforced. In terms of the two areas referred to by the Honourable Senator, the assessments of the 100 homes reveal the following. In terms of standards of care, 24 homes met the legislative requirements and standards as outlined in the not yet proclaimed Homes for Older Persons Act. 42 homes had the required items but did not meet the legislative standards. 30 homes did not have the required items and did not meet the standards. In terms of administration and management, 8 homes met the legislative requirements and standards. 33 homes had the required items but did not meet the legislative standards, and 59 homes did not have the required items and did not meet the standards. The Ministry of Social Development and Family Services does regular follow-up visits, both announced and unannounced, and we conduct those visits in collaboration with the division's inspectors, sometimes with the assistance of public health inspectors and the district health visitors of the Ministry of Health. And those visits are made to the homes that did not meet the legislative requirements and or standards to facilitate compliance with the proposed Act. In terms of action which has been taken to improve the monitoring and regulations of home, the Ministry held a meeting in March with officials of the Ministry of Health to address the inclusion of an inspector from the Division of Aging on the multidisciplinary team which usually inspect homes and private hospitals for the purpose of licensure. And this is to enable greater collaboration. In addition, the Ministry is working towards enabling the proclamation of the Homes for Older Persons Act. Thank you, Madam President.
Richards.
Thank you again, Minister. Thank you, Madam President. Can the Minister indicate, in lieu of the data given as to homes not meeting the care standard and or administrative and management standard, what mandates have these homes been given, since the elderly in some of these homes are classified as vulnerable groups?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam President. The Ministry of Social Development and Family Services has been basically using moral suasion to convince the operators of these homes to comply with the provisions of the Home for Older Persons Act, because it has not been proclaimed thus far. And we do follow-up visits, and we seek to ensure that the homes operate at least to a minimum standard. In that manner, that is the best way we can at this time protect the vulnerable in those homes.
Senator Richards.
Can the Minister indicate if the data or assessment has indicated any instances of neglect putting residents of some of these homes at risk, as has been reported in some arms of the media?
Minister.
Madam President, as at September 30th, 2016, we had 157 reports of cases of elder abuse. Of those cases, 51 pertained to older persons' homes, a percentage of 25% of the total cases received. As far as possible, reports are responded to in real time relative to the level of the crisis. However, few reports are received monthly to assess those homes. And what we have found also, Madam President, is that most of these reports are in terms of older persons being abused in their homes, not at senior citizen homes. But we respond to all reports and we take the necessary action. Where necessary persons have to be removed, we remove them.
Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on definite matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Introduction of bills. Motions relating to the business or sitting of the Senate and moved by a minister. Public business, government business, bills second reading.
Minister of Finance.
Over there. Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Vary the Appropriation of the Sum, the issue of which was authorized by the Appropriation Financial Year 2017 Act 2016, be now read a second time. Madam President, unlike the other place, what we are debating here is the finance variation of appropriation, which is a bill which has 5 clauses and a schedule. And the 5 clauses are the title, the interpretation, the reference to the schedule, where we have the changes in the heads of expenditure. That would be clauses 3 and 4. And clause 5 also refers to the schedule. And therefore, Madam President, let me just deal with the variations which are the subject of this bill. It is my understanding that details of the proposed changes were circulated to all senators, this document. And with respect to these details, there were increases to 21 heads of expenditure and decreases to 2 heads of expenditure, resulting in a variation of $1,188,684,544 under recurrent expenditure and $209,441,000 under the public sector investment program from the consolidated fund. The funding for this variation will be met from sums already appropriated to certain heads of expenditure within the Appropriation Act 2017, which was passed by the Parliament in October of 2016. So there's no supplementation of the budget. The total budgetary numbers remain the same, and this is simply a movement of sums of money from one head to the other. There are 5 heads of expenditure that require supplementary resources in excess of $100 million. These are the Ministry of National Security, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Public Utilities, and the Ministry of Housing. The funds are required to facilitate payment for outstanding liabilities and to allow those ministries to continue the effective discharge of their functions. The other variations are lesser in number, so I will just focus on these 5 heads for the time being. The Ministry of National Security requires an additional sum of $149.5 million, and from this sum, $22.6 million is to meet a funding shortfall to facilitate the payment of salaries and allowances for contract officers, including contract officers in critical areas such as legal, project execution, ICT, CCTV, international affairs officers, etc. The sum of $126.9 million is also required under the development program of the Ministry of National Security to settle outstanding payments to Huawei International and Huawei Technologies for the supply and installation of telecommunications equipment and software, training and technical support for the National Operations Center, and to Harris Corporation for the supply, delivery, and maintenance and training provided in connection with a digital safety communication system for the police service. With respect to education, additional funding of $180.5 million is required for the purchase of 13,600 laptops and 1,600 replacement batteries, a total of $60.7 million. Serval is also being given additional funding to provide with critical training and education, counseling and support at junior life centers, early childhood care and education centers, adolescent development and skills training and adolescent development program, all run by Serval. Serval is being given an additional $15 million for fiscal 2017. The National Schools Dietary Services Limited, or school feeding program, is being given an additional allocation of $50 million to allow it to continue to supply meals to primary and secondary school students. YTEC is being given an additional $30 million to allow it to continue its skill training courses at its 26 centers. The Accreditation Council is being given $5 million to pay arrears of salary and allowances stemming from previous industrial agreements. And finally, for education, a sum of $19.8 million is being given to that ministry to allow them to settle interest and principal loan obligations on an RBC loan for the design and construction of early childhood centers and primary and secondary schools. With respect to health, an additional $196.5 million is being given to that ministry to facilitate outstanding payments at 3 RHAs, Northwest, North Central, and Southwest. I'm told that the others have not requested additional funds for the supply of critical goods and services, including medical supplies and equipment, plant maintenance services, food at institutions, security, medical gases, and for patient referrals of private medical institutions. With respect to public utilities, the sum of $275 million is required to assist TT Post with additional allocation of $42.5 million to meet the shortfall on its operating expenses for the balance of the year. Solid Waste Management Company, $4.7 million to repay them essentially for the payment of the second tranche of arrears of wages and cost of living allowances to daily rated employees, back pay. And WASA, $227 million to meet a payment of arrears of $137 million to DeSalcott and outstanding liabilities for security, electricity, facilities, lease and rental, etc. of $90 million. With respect to housing, the money to be provided is primarily for loan arrangements in the sum of $283.8 million to allow the Ministry of Housing to meet principal and interest payments on an ANSA Bank $1.5 billion loan taken out by the previous administration and I'm told spent by them too. And to facilitate a debt obligation of $13 million on a loan finalized in October 2016 with ANSA Merchant Bank being serviced by UDICOT. And finally, to provide additional funds of $80 million to undertake physical infrastructure work at several locations in order to provide security of tenure to eligible squatters who have satisfied the necessary requirements under the State Lands Regulation of Tenure Act. These works for regularization of squatters are estimated at $75 million. And a further $5 million is being provided to the Ministry of Housing to provide subsidies for low-income families to finance home improvement. To give effect to these increases and the other increases which are in the schedule, savings were identified from 2 heads of expenditure. The 2 heads being under the Ministry of Finance, savings of $1,363,125,544, including $86 million from the Food Price Support Program. We were advised by the Ministry of Social Development that they do not require all of the money that was originally appropriated for that program, and therefore the savings are available. And from the Infrastructure Development Fund, $1,257,619,525 is being made available. And from the CARICOM Development Fund, we have limited our contribution to the second funding cycle of the fund to a maximum of $10 million US, or rounding that off to 70 million TT for this fiscal year. With respect to the IDF funds, the fund is a rolling fund which has deposits in it just like the GATE fund, and the transfer of $1.2 billion from that fund will not significantly affect the ability of the government to do its capital projects because the fund already had a surplus in it quite close to that amount. With respect to other matters, The declining oil prices have had an impact on petroleum product prices, which has had an effect on the fuel subsidy. And this has translated into a lower resource utilization under the fuel subsidy, which has resulted in savings of $35 million under the Ministry of Energy. So we are transferring funds out of finance and out of energy in areas where we are able to do that without significantly affecting the government's programs and the supply of goods and services and our capital development program. So that's a summary of the major items of variation that would be contained in the bill and would have been further expanded upon by the document that was given to honorable senators. Madam President, I also now want to deal with a few other areas that are outside of, to some extent, outside of the bill, but well, if you want me to sit down, I will. I'd be very happy, having finished dealing with the bill. Through you, Madam President. I see that the opposition would like me to stop. But I don't think anybody else wants me to stop. So that I will just report on a few matters. Oil prices have fluctuated since October 2016 when the budget was read, or September 30th actually, trading in a $10 band between $45 for West Texas Intermediate, which is the type of oil that is closest to the basket of crudes that are produced in Trinidad and Tobago, and $55. So that we've seen the price of oil fluctuate between 45 and 55. Just before I got up to speak, I had a check on the price of oil, and I got it was 49. I heard you sort of voce, Mr. Small. So it's been fluctuating today between 47.75 and 49.66. It's about 49. When I read this speech in the other place, it was 47. So it has gone up by $1, $1.50 within the last week. However, the economy has faced 3 consecutive years of economic decline, caused by a 23% fall in petroleum output between 2013 and 2016. And I made the point in the other place, and in order to ensure that we have no misunderstandings, in 2016, oil production, national oil production from all producers, not just Petrotrin, but from all oil producers in Trinidad and Tobago, national oil production dropped to 66,000 barrels a day. Now, for those of us who are familiar with oil production in Trinidad and Tobago, we will know that that is the lowest level for 50 years. That level was last seen back in the 50s and the 60s, 66,000 barrels per day. And production went way up beyond that, doubled in the 1980s. But fortunately, for a number of reasons, including a concentrated focus by this government on getting oil production back up, for a number of reasons, to reduce the cost to Petrotrin of purchasing crude and also to generate a revenue, we now have oil production back up to approximately 76,000 barrels per day, and that's total oil production. So oil production has increased by approximately 10,000 barrels per day since last year. However, it's still way below what it was in 2014. Oil production was over 100,000 barrels per day in 2010 and dropped to about 80,000 barrels per day around 2014. So we're still below where it should be. And with that drop in production and a drop in price, because in 2014 the oil price was over $100. I think it hit about $108, $109, $110 in that year, and then collapsed to below $30 in early 2016, around February 2016, if my memory tells me correctly. It dropped to about $27 or $28. So there was a 75% fall off in the price of oil while production was coming down. So that's essentially what is often referred to as a double whammy. So we got hit with a fall in price and a fall in production at the same time. What this has done to Trinidad and Tobago is that when you look at the revenues from petroleum as defined by the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, and that's a good definition because you're looking at revenues from natural gas, you're looking at revenues from oil. Petroleum is defined in a particular way. We have seen a fall off in revenue from petroleum. I've indicated this previously, but it needs repeating, of over $17 billion per year. So we have had a drop in national revenue, national income of over $17 billion per year. But it's more profound when you look at foreign exchange. What has happened, all our petroleum revenues are earned in foreign exchange. And what has happened to our foreign exchange inflows is that we've lost $2.5 billion US dollars per year in foreign exchange inflows. And that brings me to a point of, I wouldn't call it digression, but a point I need to make. Because in the other place I made a comment that the Ministry of Finance had asked the central bank, when it is injecting funds into the system, to ask the commercial banks to give priority to manufacturing. And that led to a hue and a cry and a lot of noise. And I'm reading here from the Express. I think this would be, what date is this? Friday, 12th of May. So this is last week. And it's a statement made by Dr. Farrell to the effect that we should not be telling commercial banks to prioritize forex to manufacturing, and that we are introducing exchange controls, and that the bank should resist this proposition. And it's as if we're going back to the old ECO system, and that it's going to lead to, I think the actual words I'm seeing here, a royal mess. And I noticed some commentators who, I will say this very bluntly, can't think for themselves, just like to piggyback on statements made by particular individuals, because ipso facto, when the person say them, it is so. You know, because so-and-so says something, it is so. And then commentators just piggyback on that without thinking for themselves. I want to put into the record, because I'm really getting tired of this. I want to put this into the record. I have in my possession a copy of an aid memoir dated March the 2nd, 2009. Okay? An aid memoir from the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. And in those days, the central bank from time to time would send out a document, which is a public document, to all commercial banks. And this is an aid memoir from the central bank, March 2nd, 2009. And it's entitled Operations of the Foreign Exchange Market. And it has this to say. It talks about a number of things. In the role of the central bank, intervention in the domestic foreign exchange market, exchange rate for intervention, exchange rate for intervention funds, and guidelines on the sale of intervention funds. And listen to this sentence from March 2nd, 2009. Intervention funds are to be used to settle trade-related requests for foreign exchange from the public. So at least for the last 8 years, and I'm told it goes way back before that, the central bank has been telling the commercial banks what to do with the foreign exchange that it injects into the system. But listen to this one. November 15, 2010, under the former administration, here's a letter coming from the central bank, sent to all commercial banks, November the 15th, 2010. It doesn't matter. It's under the former administration. Foreign exchange market. over the last 2 months or so, we have been seeing an increase in the level of queues reported by the commercial banks. The manufacturing sector has since indicated that it is experiencing acute difficulties in obtaining foreign exchange. November the 15th, 2010, almost 7 years ago. Therefore, I am requesting you give priority to requests for foreign exchange for imports for the manufacturing sector. So when, in my speech in the other place, I said I have asked the central bank to ask the commercial banks to give priority to trade and manufacturing, I was simply doing something that had been done in this country for more than 10 years in writing, Madam President. And following the statement, following the policy decision, the central bank has corresponded with the commercial banks as it has been doing every 2 weeks for at least 10 years. So how many interventions is that? Over 200 times the central bank would have corresponded with the commercial banks and asked them when they are distributing the foreign exchange injected into the system by the central bank. And let me explain what that means. That is the country's foreign exchange, that's the government's foreign exchange that it earns from the oil sector. The central bank from time to time will put foreign exchange into the system to top up the quantity of foreign exchange available. But that foreign exchange belongs to the central bank. It is in fact the government's foreign exchange that is converted by the central bank into TT dollars, which it then gives to the government, puts it into its current account and runs the country. We run the country with that income stream. So that the central bank for many, many years, and at least 10, whenever it put its own foreign exchange into the system, not the one belonging to the private sector, but the government's foreign exchange, would write the banks and say, please give priority to trade, please give priority to manufacturing. This has been going on for years. As I said, it may have happened maybe 200, 100 times. And therefore, for anyone to say that this is something new, that this is something strange, that this is going to wreck the economy, that this will lead to a royal mess, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. And I thought I should say that because I find the commentary is just escalating as if this is something that dropped from the sky and has never happened before. And I want to put on the record, and I have put on the record, what the central bank has been telling the commercial banks with respect to the distribution of foreign exchange. So I want to put that matter to rest. Now, let me move on to another matter that has created a problem for us. In the other place, I made the point that with the assistance of all members of Parliament, we are very hopeful that we could enact the gambling and gaming legislation this year, 2017, and put in place a gambling and gaming commission to regulate gambling, because there's tremendous leakage of revenue in that area, and there are issues with money laundering, insufficient regulation. And I said in the other place, I expect to get a pushback. It didn't take long. The casino owners and operators came out and said, what is he talking about? This is all nonsense. There's no problem. We don't know issues with leakage of revenue. There's nothing illegal going on in our sector. Well, I have in my possession, sent to me today, a country report from the United States of America on Trinidad and Tobago and a number of other countries in terms of money laundering and terrorist financing and things like that. And on page 175 of this document, it says, Trinidad and Tobago's anti-money laundering regime is unable to quantify the extent to which fraud and corruption contribute to money laundering. It goes on to say, money laundering occurs outside of the traditional financial system. While public casinos and online gaming are illegal in Trinidad and Tobago, gamblers take advantage of private members' clubs, which operate as casinos and are able to move large amounts of cash due to Trinidad and Tobago's lack of adequate anti-money laundering supervision of this sector. And this is not me saying this, Madam Speaker. This is the United States Department of State, Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, Strategy Report, Volume 2, Money Laundering and Financial Crimes, March 2017. So that the point we keep making in this place is that because of the lack of regulation of the gambling and gaming sector, Trinidad and Tobago is continuing to be viewed unfavorably by the international agencies with respect to regulation of the casino industry and dealing with the potential for money laundering that could occur in that sector. And anybody who believes that these things don't happen is just dreaming. Because if you look at what occurs in Las Vegas, Atlantic City, and any other center for gambling and gaming, they have very, very strict regulations and very tight controls, and all of these activities are managed by commissions, by governmental commissions, because they know all the attendant ills that come with gambling. Gambling addiction, tax evasion, money laundering, and the kind of people that gravitate towards the gambling sector. I mean, I don't have to read and spell for members here, but all developed countries have put in place systems because of the problems that can occur with this sector. And I remember reading a report that Trinidad and Tobago must be the only country in the world with such a vast, unregulated gambling and casino sector. And I am certain that we are. We are probably the only country in the world that has a thriving gambling and gaming sector that is largely unregulated. We're under the guise of another piece of legislation, the private members clubs. And the way private members clubs are supposed to operate, Madam President, is that everybody joins the club. It's supposed to be not for profit, so that you pay your money, and whenever you collect all the winnings, you're supposed to redistribute the winnings to all of the players. That's how the private members club is supposed to operate. But I mean, I don't think a private members club has operated in Trinidad and Tobago in that way for at least the last 25 years. I've never been to one. I've never been to one. I'm not a casino. I'm not a frequenter of casinos. I don't even know what the inside of a casino looks like. But the fact of the matter is that this charade where they are operating under the private members club regime, where nobody's supposed to be making money. As I said, all the profits are supposed to be redistributed to the members. This charade is occurring right under our faces, right in front of our eyes. I mean, if you have a bar, I understand, and this is not coming from me, you know. This is coming from members of the opposition MPs, not senators, elected members of parliament in the opposition in this place, on the other place, have said if you go down south, you go into a bar, every street corner you meet a bar with a slot machine in it. I don't know, because I don't go into these bars and I don't play slot machines, but I have to go on what I'm told, and my understanding is that the enforcement of our laws with respect to these matters is extremely lax. I understand that persons would register one machine, and it would just move around. So some, you know, a person may be controlling 1,000 machines, but they're only paying for 1 or 2 machines or 3 machines, as the case may be. I understand they even bringing them in like how they used to bring in foreign used cars, bringing them in pieces and assembling them. I read it in the papers today, Madam President. I read in the Guardian that there's an association that deals with this. Not the casino, another association. And they said that they import these machines in parts and they assemble them and then they lease them to these bars and other establishments throughout Trinidad with some agreed arrangement. And I'm told that the enforcement with respect to the regulation of these machines is very lax. And what they do in other countries, These things have to be all online, have to be connected like lotto machines, so that you can't have revenue coming in and revenue coming out without it being recorded somewhere. The weakness of our system is nobody records anything. So nobody's recording how much money is being put into these slot machines. Nobody's recording how much money coming out of these slot machines. And similarly with blackjack and roulette and all these other games. As I said, we are the only country, it was the Western Hemisphere actually, the only country in the Western Hemisphere that has a thriving casino sector with no regulation whatsoever. So we just have to keep pushing. And I am very glad to hear what UNC elected members are saying in the other place, that they have given me some of the information, and they seem to be very gung-ho in terms of addressing this matter. And I won't say much more about it because it's before a joint select committee. I have not spoken at all about our deliberations, as you will realize. I haven't mentioned anything that we have discussed, but I'm hoping that out of the deliberations of the JSC, after we listen to everyone and we interview all interested parties, that we will be able to get conclusion and bring this thing to finality and be able to enact this legislation and install the commission and have proper enforcement of the casino industry in Trinidad and Tobago. I would not want to speak too much on property tax, Madam President, because I've received a pre-action letter, I think from somebody in this house. I'm not sure. I think I saw a name in there somewhere of somebody in this house. I'm not 100%, but there were a lot of lawyers, all UNC, every single one. And so anyway, Anand Ramlogan is not UNC. Gerald Ramdeen is not UNC. Come on, give me a break. So I got a pre-action letter about property tax, and therefore I do not wish to say anything more than speak in general terms about that tax, to point out that the rates of tax in Trinidad and Tobago are among the lowest in the world, and that no less a person than my predecessor in the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Hawaii, indicated in 2014 in his 2014 budget speech that property tax is a fair and equitable tax. So, Madam President, how much more time do I have? Okay, about 10 minutes. All right. I would just want to give some highlights of the fiscal outturn for 2017. As I indicated, oil prices have been traveling in a band between $45 and $50, but for the first 6 months of the year, I can inform honorable members that oil prices average $50.45. Gas prices, again, have been moving, but mainly in an upward trajectory, so that the Henry Hub price of natural gas, spot market price, has averaged $3.30 per MMBTU. Now, our budget figures were $48 for oil, so it's averaged $50.45, and $2.25 for gas, so it's averaged $3.30. We've had an increase in gas production. We've had a strengthening of natural gas prices, as I've indicated. But we're still losing over $2 billion in foreign exchange, which makes it quite difficult for us to deal with demand for foreign exchange. We have seen an increase in tax collection from petroleum companies. Supplementary petroleum tax, because we crossed $50, became due for the first time for several years in the first quarter of this year. We have had an increase in tax collections from corporations, primarily due to the millionaire tax. We had some tax collections from individual millionaires as well, Senator Ramdeen. And we had a reduction in collections from value-added tax, possibly because of a decline in discretionary spending, but also reduced spending by oil and gas companies. Our expenditure has been 14% lower than projected. So we have been keeping a tight rein on expenditure. So we are below our budget projections in terms of expenditure, we had a drawdown from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund of approximately 250 million US, but I'm pleased to say that after the first drawdown last year of 375 million US, the level in the fund went to $5.4 billion. And in the last 12 months before we, actually in the 10-month period between the first drawdown and the second drawdown, we recovered $275 million in income from the fund. So the fund went from 5.4 back up to almost 5.7. And in the 2 months since we have done the last drawdown, we've recovered another 100 million US dollars in, well, we've earned another 100 million US. So basically speaking, the fund went from 5.75 down to 5.4, and we withdrew 375 to make that happen. And since then, from the 5.4 to the time we did the second drawdown, we recovered 275 million, so it went back up to 5.675 billion. We took out another 250, so it went back down to 5.4, the same level as it was last year when we did the first drawdown, and it has now recovered to 5.54 billion. So the fund managers, the point to be made is the fund managers are doing very, very well. The fund has earned 375 million US dollars in the last 12 months, which I appreciate, Madam Speaker, is almost 2.5 billion Trinidad and Tobago dollars. So the fund has recovered extremely well. It's doing extremely well, and I want to compliment the fund managers in terms of the earnings from their investments. I wish some of our local institutions like the National Insurance Board could do a little better, because the fund is generating about 6% per annum in income, and NIB is 2%. So these are things that we as a country, we need to look at in terms of how we use our savings and so on. With respect to the downgrades that we received from Moody's and Standard & Poor's, this S&P downgrade was expected, but quite positive in terms of the outlook for Trinidad and Tobago being changed from negative to stable. And let me explain what happens when you have a change in outlook. When you're on a negative watch, which is what Trinidad and Tobago has been for the last several years, because of the collapse of oil prices in 2014 and the corresponding reduction in revenue from petroleum, the rating agencies put Trinidad and Tobago on a negative outlook. Stands to reason, because we had a tremendous drop-off in national revenue. And we got downgrades starting as far back as 2014, 2015. And because Trinidad and Tobago was on a negative outlook, the rating agencies would do annual reviews of our credit rating. And they did their annual review this year, and they have downgraded us, both of them, Moody's and Standard & Poor's, but they have changed the outlook to stable, because they no longer believe that our economy is in a negative spiral. They now believe, the two rating agencies now believe, that our economy has stabilized and we now have a stable outlook. In the case of Standard & Poor's, they gave us a BBB rating, which is still well into the investment grade rating, and Moody's put us into a BA1 rating, which is just below the lowest level in the investment grade rating. What this does, it affects our ability to borrow in terms of the interest rate that we will be charged by lenders when we go to borrow. And your credit rating is simply an assessment of what your interest rate should be and what your credibility is in terms of repayment of lending. But one of the interesting things from Moody's is that when they did the rating, they made the point that Trinidad and Tobago has
Please
not...
say you have 5 more minutes.
Sure, I'm nearly finished. Trinidad and Tobago has never defaulted on a loan, ever. So when we saw this, that Standard & Poor's was giving us an investment grade rating, and Moody's was putting us below the investment grade, but Moody's was telling us that the country has never defaulted on a loan. And there were some other issues that we found of serious concern with respect to the Moody's rating, because we made the point to them that it's difficult to understand how a country with the following characteristics could be deemed to be a credit risk. And the characteristics were official reserves of US $9.1 billion, or 10 months of import cover, a heritage fund of US $5.5 billion, equivalent to 25% of GDP, and deposits in sinking funds, which we make all the time, for the express purpose of repaying debt, currently totaling $6.5 billion TT in sinking funds set aside to pay debt. So you have a HSF of $5.5 billion, 25% of GDP, reserves of over $9 billion US, and deposits in sinking funds of $6.5 billion. So we made the point that how is it possible for a country with all of these assets to be deemed a credit risk? And the point is, when you look at these indicators, the government of Trinidad and Tobago as a country has the ability to repay its current central government external debt several times over. So we have enough money in sinking funds, enough money in the HSF, enough funding in our reserves to repay our debt several times over. So it doesn't really make any sense. And this is why we've decided there are 3 rating agencies that are considered the big 3. Standard & Poor's is the largest, followed by Moody's, the second largest, and the third largest is Fitch. And we have decided that for balance, if one rating agency is giving us investment grade and the other is giving us non-investment grade, there's a disconnect here somewhere. So we have decided to approach the third rating agency to get a rating from them, so we'll have a balanced perspective, so we'll have a better understanding. Whatever the rating is, whether it's a good rating or a bad rating, it is necessary for us as a country to understand what is going on so we can take appropriate action. But we do not agree with the rating given to us by Moody's. As far as we are concerned, it is wholly unwarranted. And this is why we're going to Fitch to see if Fitch will say the same thing or if Fitch will agree with Standard & Poor's. And with those few words, Madam President, I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, I shall now propose the question for debate. The question is that a bill entitled An Act to Vary the Appropriation of the Sum, the issue of which was authorized by the Appropriation Financial Year 2017 Act 2016, be now read a second time. Senator Mark.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I rise to make my contribution on the bill that is before us, which is an act to vary the appropriation of the sum, the issue of which was authorized by the Appropriation Financial Year 27 Act 2016. And also to address among the issues raised by the Honourable Minister of Finance on the public finances of our country. Madam President, you know, it has been said that once you step into the water, you would have stepped. And every step into the water represents the past. And if we are to liberate ourselves from the troubled water that we are stepping in, and we have stepped in, we need to literally leapfrog, take a giant leap in order to arrive at a new place. But what we have witnessed over the last 20 months is almost the same old, same old. We are almost in the same place, Madam President. So the minister has brought a bill, as he indicated, varying from one head to another, but as he also indicated, not increasing the appropriation through any supplementation. What we have is a variation. And of course, he has taken the time to explain to us, briefly as he has done, the fiscal outturn for the country over the last 6 months. Madam President, what I would attempt to do in my brief period available to me is to examine the finances, public finances, look at what I want to consider to be the precipitous decline in our capital program or capital expenditure, and to show, Madam President, with this capital expenditure decline, we are also experiencing job losses and poor economic growth or negative economic growth. Madam President, concomitant with that is the control or management of our foreign exchange and the precipitous decline in our foreign exchange between September of 2015 to the current time. We also need, Madam President, to link this to the deterioration in our dollar, depreciation in the country's dollar. And of course, Madam President, when we look at the overall impact on the society and which segment of the society is carrying the burdens that have been placed as a result of these adjustments. Madam President, the minister has provided us with some information as it relates to the savings that resulted in the infrastructure development program being reduced by 1.3 billion or thereabouts. But what was also important to note is that the public sector investment program for 2016-2017, for the first 6 months, was supposed to be $2.7 billion. What actually occurred, Madam President, was a disbursement of $1 billion. So the capital expenditure program of our country was reduced from 2.7 billion to 1 billion, meaning, Madam President, that $1.7 billion would not have been disbursed for capital projects in Trinidad and Tobago. That simply means, Madam President, that a number of capital projects that we were supposed to have on stream in the first 6 months of 2016-2017 were not realized. And as you know, that is critical for economic growth, for generating employment and jobs in our country. And Madam President, the Central Bank Economic Bulletin of 2017 revealed that our capital program has been reducing since the PNM came into office. On page 30 of this economic bulletin, dated March 27, 2017, we saw where in 2014-2015, the capital program was $7.6 billion. Then when the PNM Red and Ready Brigade arrived, it was reduced to $4.7 billion. And even though, Madam President, it was reduced to $4.7 billion, the central bank was able to show that capital expenditure decreased by 76.1% in the third quarter of 2016. So what we have, Madam President, is that in 2015-2016, the capital program went to 4.7. It increased and it went to 5.1 in 2016-2017. But even though it has gone to 5.1 for the entire fiscal year, what we are being told by the Minister of Finance is that for the first half of fiscal 2016-2017, what has happened, Madam President, is that the government was unable to implement its capital program and was only able to utilize $1 billion out of $2.7 billion. Now, Madam President, that has, as I said, implications for job creation, for economic growth, for capital development, infrastructural works in our country. So what we have, Madam President, is a situation, as the Minister admitted, we have had 3 consecutive years of negative economic growth in this country. And this fiscal year, even though the Minister, he didn't say it today, but he said it elsewhere, that he anticipates some small increase in real GDP growth come 2016-2017 fiscal year. But the reality is, Madam President, we are trying to determine where this economic growth is going to come from. The International Monetary Fund, in its World Economic Outlook for 2017, published in April of this year, revealed that this economy contracted by 5.11% in 2016. That is the extent of the economic contraction of this economy as at the end of fiscal 2016. The Minister is, however, saying that the Central Statistical Office, which is the only body that is responsible for issuing growth figures, I read that somewhere. Your source. Your source is your document that you issued, your statement that was given to the House of Representatives and is on the Hansard record. That is the source. That is the source. No, you can't tell me what page you go to. He's out of line.
You just
yes, let me talk
address
to you.
the chair, please.
Yes, Madam President. I'm being disturbed. Madam President. I'm trying to be very calm, but he's. So, Madam President, what is happening is that the International Monetary Fund has said minus 5.11. The minister is saying the economy contracted by minus 2.3. Who to believe? Who to believe, Madam President? What we do know, Madam President, is that the economy of Trinidad and Tobago has contracted for a third consecutive year. And from all indications, given the policy direction and trend of this government and this Minister of Finance, the Honorable Minister of Finance, we can anticipate, Madam President, a further contraction in economic output for 2017. There is no light at the end of the tunnel under the PNM and this Minister of Finance. And in spite, Madam President, of whatever they may try to say, and I want to tell you, Madam President, the Minister of Finance has been providing this country with what I call questionable data. I want to be very charitable in my language. Madam President, when we look at the debt to GDP ratio, as we decline in economic growth and the government engages in huge borrowings internationally, domestically, Madam President, what are we seeing? We are seeing where Trinidad and Tobago has now crossed the 60% threshold that the OECD countries have said we should not go beyond. We are now 61% debt to GDP, thanks to the PNM and the Minister of Finance. That has been gifted to us by him and the PNM. And Madam President, the borrowings are not yet over. So this government, Madam President, has taken us from a position where the debt to GDP was less than 50% or thereabout when we left office. And within 20 months, Madam President, it has gone to 61% debt to GDP. And I want to debunk this argument that the minister is attempting to peddle on the population, that we were responsible. The People's Partnership, the United National Congress, Madam President, was responsible for this huge debt that they inherited when we limited office in 2015 of just about 50% debt to GDP. Madam President, what the minister has failed to explain to this population is that when the mess took place in 2009, January, involving CLICO, under the stewardship of a governor who is now advisor, I understand. The minister could exclaim that. But I understand he's an advisor to the current Minister of Finance. But it took place, Madam President, under the watch of that former governor of the central bank, who failed to put in place certain prudential regulations to ensure that we do not have a CLICO debacle. Madam President, that didn't take place. So much so that CLICO bus, CLICO went belly up and they claimed they came begging for rescue. And the PNM rescued the CLICO group in 2009. Madam President, you know what it cost this country? It cost this country over $20 billion. Well, the minister is now saying that you can't trust his figures. But he's saying 28. I am saying, Madam President, it cost us $20 billion. But you know what is significant about it? The $20 billion, Madam President, some were raised by the former PNM, led by the late Patrick Manning. And we had to raise another amount in order to make sure policyholders and other creditors were not deprived, and therefore the systemic risk to the whole financial order would not have been severe and or grave. So it is as a result, Madam President, of this intervention by the PP government back then that caused the debt to GDP to rise from the point that it was, Madam President, to the point where we are now. It is largely responsible. So I take umbrage for the Minister of Finance. And Madam President, if I may, I want to refer you to a document. It is the Economic Bulletin of the Central Bank, July of 2013. And I want to refer you to an article written by researchers within the Central Bank entitled The Impact of the Global Financial Crisis on the Fiscal Accounts and Public Sector Debt in Trinidad and Tobago. It was prepared by Kester Thompson, Richard Cassie, and Joseph Cotton. And I want you to listen very carefully, Madam President, as I read to you and to this honorable House what these gentlemen said in 2013 in this article about the bailout of CLICO and the rising debt to GDP. Madam President, I quote on page 100 of this report. Total public sector debt, net of open market operations, increased, Madam President, from 24.4% of GDP in fiscal 2008 to 44.5% in fiscal 2012. I read again. Of this amount, 19.7 billion, or 13.5% of GDP, was due to borrowing to fund the CLICO bailout. I go on, Madam President. The remaining 7.6% of GDP can be attributed to borrowing or borrowings related to deficit financing. Madam President, as a result, the government did not have to borrow, that is the PP, to finance the deficits incurred over the period 2009 to 2012. In fact, if financing related to CLICO bailout is excluded, the central government debt actually declined by 575 million, or 0.4% of GDP during the period. Instead, the government's cash balances at the central bank fell from 17.7 billion to 3.6 billion. Madam President, the point I'm making here is that the bulk of the debt that was accumulated between 2010 to 2013 under the People's Partnership came as a result of the bailout, which amounted, Madam President, to 19.7 billion at the time. And what these authors are showing is that if you minus that, we would have been in a surplus situation. So it is very disingenuous, Madam President, for anyone to give the impression to the country that we saddled this country with a 50.1% debt to GDP at the end of 2015 when, Madam President, out of that 50%, 13.5% came as a result of this debt of $19.7 billion. And that was as a result of the government's failure, the PNM failure, Madam President, to properly regulate the insurance companies and the financial sector, Madam President. So I thought it necessary to deal with this point. Another area, Madam President, we need to deal with. Our foreign exchange reserve, when in September of 2015, our foreign exchange reserves stood at 10.4 or 10.5 billion, Madam President. I'll give you the exact figures, Madam President, so I don't misquote. It is 10,459.2 billion. That is where we were in September of 2015. Today, the government of this country has failed to generate, Madam President, any foreign exchange. You know where we are today, Madam President, in terms of foreign exchange? And it is depleting at a rapid rate. Today, as we speak, Madam President, as at the end of April 2017, our foreign exchange is $9.53 billion. It is just under, it is coming under $9 billion. $9.53 billion, Madam President, as at the end of April. That is the state of play. And Madam President, may I advise you that if we did not go through with the Minister of Finance on this so-called road show in the United States and raise $1 billion US, our foreign exchange reserves at this time would have been $8 billion. Because that $1 billion, Madam President, that was raised went into our foreign exchange reserves. So we borrowing to buff up and to build up, Madam President, our foreign exchange. That is the state of play. So this government, Madam President, that speaks about prudence in managing this economy and dealing with the interests of the people has been a total, complete, and absolute failure when it comes to the management, Madam President, of the people's business in this country. And Madam President, we can see it throughout the numbers, wherever we turn, Madam President. Madam President, may I also invite you to look at the state of play, Madam President, as at the end of 2016, to tell you, Madam President, where we are with this particular regime. This is Central Bank Economic Bulletin, January of 2017. It is called the Statistical Appendix, Madam President. And Madam President, when we go to Table 1, we look at the third quarter of 2016. We look at GDP for the first quarter, minus 5.3. For the second quarter, minus 8.2. For the third quarter, minus 10.8. Madam President, if you go to the energy sector, minus 9.1 first quarter, minus 12.4 second quarter, minus 18.3 third quarter. That is the state of play under this administration in the energy sector. The non-energy sector is no different. First quarter, minus 3.0. Second quarter, minus 5.8, Madam President. Third quarter, minus 6.7. This is the state of play involving this administration. This economy has gone nowhere fast, Madam President. And the Minister of Finance and this government apparently do not have a clue, Madam President, how to rescue this economy, how to diversify this economy, whether horizontally or vertically. They don't have a clue. And what is happening, Madam President, it is the ordinary people who are paying the price for this government's incompetence. Madam President, now you have the Minister of Finance telling, no, he has said, and okay, Madam President, he has attacked his chairman on the Board of Economic Development, the one in Friday's Express, the 12th of May, page 10, Trinidad Express. Farrell warns Imbert over Forex partnerizing, it could lead to a royal mess. Is what he's now saying, that Terence Farrell is totally wrong, because he bring out 8 memoir of 2009, he bring out 8 memoir 2011, or 2015 rather, and he indicates, Madam President, that is what the central bank does. You know, Madam President, when I listened to the Minister of Finance, I thought I was hearing the former governor of the central bank, Clarence Rambaran, talk. No, not Clarence Rambaran, rather. Jawala Rambaran. Jawala. Yeah. Maybe you're heading there after. Maybe you're heading there after. So, Madam President, when I listen to the minister, because the minister is now saying, this is our money, but we always said that. So when the former governor of the central bank indicated to the nation who was utilizing our foreign exchange, Madam President, it was our money. It was our money, Madam President. So the minister objected to the behavior of the then governor of the central bank. And now you have Mr. Terence Farrell on page...
Point of order, 47. A matter is subject.
Senator Mark, if the matter is in fact before the court, I would ask you to desist from speaking about it.
But let us go to the royal mess, which is not before the court. It is before this court. And this royal mess that the minister has created as a result of his decision to request the governor of the central bank, Madam President, to intervene and to distribute Forex to what is called the manufacturing sector or class. Madam President, we would like to know how are these commercial banks to determine, Madam President, who to give and who not to give? Madam President, we learned, the Prime Minister told us I think 2 years ago, or just under 2 years ago, that there were billions of dollars stashed away, US dollars, at commercial banks. You have people, Madam President, hoarding foreign exchange. You have people, so this is a serious matter. Where is the minister going to get the Forex to give to the manufacturing sector? Is he going into our foreign exchange to reduce it even further? Is the minister going on another road show to raise another billion US dollars through borrowing? He can't because of the downgrading. Madam President, where is the money going to come from? Or is the minister going to raid the Heritage and Stabilization Fund again to give money to the manufacturing class? Sorry, Madam President, sorry. Yeah. Is he going to do it? So, Madam President, the question here is that the minister is proposing a measure at a time where Forex is very short, in short supply, and where there's a lot of manipulation and possible corruption in the system today. My information is that when businessmen, Madam President, goes to certain banks in this country to request for an exchange, genuine businessmen who are involved in manufacturing, they are being told, listen, you can go X place or Y Place, they have Forex at $8 to 1. So it seems like the banks in this country, some of them, are in collusion with the underworld black market. Madam President, they seem to be in collusion. And it seems to me that whoever is doing business with them, they seem to be getting greater preferential treatment over those who they do not consider to be high-valued customers. So, Madam President, the question here I ask, how are we going to determine, how is the minister going to determine who needs what and when and where? Who is to determine that? The commercial banks? Well, then why don't you take that out of the commercial banks, Madam President, and put it into the hands of the central bank? Because the central bank used to conduct ECO 0, ECO 1 in the years gone by. Let the central bank handle that matter. Since it is our money, Madam President, our foreign exchange, let the central bank handle it. Since the commercial bank seem unable and incapable of handling this matter properly and fairly. Madam President, what about ordinary people who go to these banks and they want to get foreign exchange to import medical supply or to pay for their children's education? They are not being given any preferential treatment. So certain people are being given and others are being denied, Madam President. Where are we going with this, Madam President? So it appears to us that the government has been a total failure, whether it comes, Madam President, to the issue of its ability to generate growth and create jobs in this country. It has failed. And you can see it in the data. Capital expenditure is declining in this country, not increasing, Madam President. In terms of the burdens that they have placed on the shoulders of the ordinary people, Madam President, that burden in terms of the GDP, the debt to GDP is rising. And I would like the Honorable Minister to tell this Parliament today, when is he going to stop? When is he going to stop borrowing, Madam President? At what percentage is the minister going to say, this is enough, Madam President? Well, we are saying that we have had our fill. We are saying that the country is choking and we can no longer continue borrowing. The government has to be creative like the frog. It must leap, Madam President, make a giant leap and come up with imaginative and creative solutions, Madam President, in order to deal with the issue. But for the time being, Madam President, what the government is doing is its favorite strategy. It's its only approach to things. Increase prices, increase taxes. That is their unborrowing. That is the only way, Madam President, it seems that the government is able to raise monies in this country. And of course, the latest...
You have 5 more minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. The latest assault is the property tax. And of course, the people are fighting back. The people are fighting back this oppressive regime who is seeking to seize their properties in this country. And then, Madam President, when that is enough, they are now saying, Madam President, that they want to abolish, Madam President, the Inland Revenue Department, the Value-Added Tax Division, and the Customs and Excise Division, and bring into being a new revenue authority with an army of contract employees who will have loyalty to the PNM and not to the country. How can we support that? We can never support that. Yeah. And Madam President, may I also advise the Honorable Minister of Finance, who is searching desperately for money. I want him to go to the Global Financial Integrity Report for 2013 and to see where in this country, Madam President, 33 billion US trade fraud through misinvoicing in this country for the period 2003 to 2013. And they examined 2014, and they showed where $206 million the people were defrauded because of what? Misinvoicing, under-invoicing, and over-invoicing. So you could go on the website, look for what is called the Global Integrity Report for 2013 and 2014. And if you want to get some money, I ask you to go there. Because there is where you can raise a lot of money. You know, it's 33 billion TT dollars being lost in this country between 2003 to 2013. And then they say in 2014, about 206 million US were lost. Madam President, if the government is serious about really getting at funds and trying to balance its revenue with its expenditure, you have avenues that it can traverse. And then this other thing, Madam President, which is the final point I'd like to raise, is the unemployment rate in this country. Madam President, it is almost laughable when we are told that unemployment is falling. How can unemployment be falling in this country when so many workers are being laid off? And Madam President, we have estimated close to 20,000 people laid off since the PNM came into office.
More than that.
So how can we be told, Madam President, that, you know what, Madam President, the actual figure is falling? And Madam President, I do not know to what extent the PNM government is looking at underemployment, but that is a real serious problem in our country today. So it is not only unemployment, Madam President, it's underemployment. And in closing, Madam President, I want to ask this question. I read in the papers with alarm where the Public Service Commission of this country is delegating its authority to 5 government ministries to hire staff and to discipline staff. The Office of the Prime Minister, Public Administration, Local Government, Community Development, and there's another ministry, Energy. Madam President, that, to my mind, is a most backward step. And unless we can see evidence, Madam President, I don't even know if it has been gazetted, but it is something that is totally when I was Public Administration Minister under Basdio Pandey, I approached Mr. Ken Lala to do the same thing, and he told me this thing requires a lot of training for permanent secretaries to ensure there's impartiality, fairness, and neutrality in the public service. And I just want to serve a warning on this nation. It is a dangerous path that we are traversing. And I call on the Public Service Commission to come clean and issue a statement to this country as to the modalities and where this thing was gazetted so we can properly understand what they are doing. I thank you very much, Madam President.
Senator Raffoul.
Thank you, Madam President, for the opportunity to speak. As always, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here and to contribute to this debate. To put this in perspective, today's debate is on the Variation of Appropriations Bill, also called the Midterm Review. And we're very lucky that we have the opportunity to contribute to it because it's really an executive function and we're the legislative arm. So I'm really grateful that we have this opportunity. As always, my intention is to serve and to be extremely succinct and to be technical and collaborative. My contribution today will be in 5 parts. First, I'd like to give a bit of a kind of a macro overview of what are the international trends in economics. This is really quite relevant because a lot of times we continue the status quo without stopping to look at how everything is changing. And this affects our taxes, the way we do business, and this division between public sector and private sector. Second, I'd like to comment briefly on the numbers. The Minister of Finance did a great job in going into a lot of depth, so I'm going to just be very brief on my interpretation of that. The third part of my contribution will be looking at where I commend. I think a lot of things have been done right. Fourth, I'd like to comment on the property tax. And fifth, I'd like to give my technical recommendations on going forward, addressing the fiscal imbalance and the foreign exchange imbalance. So first, looking at the macro overview of what's happening internationally. Historically, the rationale and the justification for a public sector expenditure mechanism was because private sector didn't have large volumes of capital, or there was efficiencies and economies of scale from a public sector provision of services. Things have changed so much in the last 800 years since a constitution and this Westminster system was put into place. And oftentimes we don't kind of stop and look and say, what can we tweak? How can we make this better? Have we concentrated maybe too much power in the hands of the public sector because at that point in time it was rational and necessary, and now maybe things need to change and there needs to be greater partnership? What exactly is the justification, and how does this affect taxes and how we do business on a day-to-day basis? How does this impact education system, water, energy, electricity? Everything is really impacted on how we see a justification for public expenditure. So the trends basically are that there's so much more capital in the hands of private sector citizens. And you can see the same thing in international institutions. Traditionally, there was the World Bank and the IMF and institutions that were Bretton Woods oriented. And now there's Gates Foundation, etc. There's a lot of international global philanthropy that's led by millionaires and billionaires. So everything is changing, and because of private capital being able to influence social impact initiatives. So this is something for us to, I think, just keep in mind in terms of long-term trends and be aware of how taxes and international governance can be affected longer term. Second, my interpretation of the numbers. We do have a deficit as well as a, my apologies, the word is escaping me. Pardon? Use another one. Okay, thanks. We have a deficit as well as a shortfall. The deficit is, we've had a deficit now for 9 years. We have had a recession for 3 years. So we have been overspending for a lot longer than we've actually experienced a decline in revenues. So the decline in revenues was only occurring over the last 3 years, but the deficit, i.e. our overspending, was occurring over the last 9 years. This is really important to acknowledge that it's not because of Brexit, it's not because of international oil prices, it's because we have overspent and overspent. 9 years ago, we were projected to have a deficit, and we were projected to have a decline in revenues, and we ended up having rebounding. We were very, very lucky. But we still continue to overspend and overspend and overspend. So it's important for us to recognize that our current imbalance is because of our own overspending and not necessarily because of international factors. The third thing I'd like to comment on is my commendations. There were 4 things in particular that I really liked. I know sometimes we can feel sitting here that things go so slowly, but there's this expression I learned recently that I'd like to share, and it said that we often overestimate what we can accomplish in 1 day, and we underestimate what we can accomplish in a year. The last year and a half that I've sat here, I've seen a lot of things progressing, sometimes small, sometimes slow, but when you look back, a lot of things are happening, and I think it's important for us to commend when things are happening, and it's because of collaboration between all sides, and I think it's important for us all to recognize that. So what I liked in particular, the procurement board, I like that it is really finally taking a step towards having more oversight and transparency and more value for money. I really liked the Vision 2030 process. I think it's really important, and I've recommended this before, so I'm very happy to see it's happening, that we set goals for ourselves beyond just economics. Economics is only part of our national development. And it's important for us to recognize that it's not just about economic stability, but it's also about higher purpose, higher human potential. The third thing I really liked was the intention to reduce transfers and subsidies, particularly in gasoline, by 2018, and having that defined timeline. Fourth, selling of assets. I know that a lot of people might think that it's part of our national heritage to have assets, but I think we have to recognize that we don't necessarily have a comparative advantage in running businesses in the public sector, and I think it's better for us to do exactly what we're doing, which is to move from that implementation role to a more facilitating and regulation role as a government. Fourth, I wanted to comment on the property tax. The rationale and the justification is that it is supposed to be addressing the fiscal imbalance. But the fiscal imbalance has been caused by overspending in the public sector, not by overspending in the private sector. Also, it's contradictory to me. I used to work in tax, and we have in our tax incentives to support home ownership. So it seems contradictory that on one hand we are trying to support home ownership, and on the other hand we're penalizing it. As a stable society, having home ownership is recognized as something that is important for our economic stability. If we are constantly worrying about, our bills every single month, it prevents us from progressing as individuals because we are so caught in survival mode that we can't really progress as individuals and as a society. So it's important to recognize that home ownership is a good thing. It helps us to be stable and to be able to expand beyond just survival mode. In terms of the penalty on home ownership, it again is an extension of penalizing emolument income earners, which are already the brunt of the PAYE contributors for the fiscal revenues earned from taxes. And there's so much uncertainty around it that a lot of elderly people and a lot of people who own their homes but do not have a high income are really worried about how they're going to pay for it. I think we have to make sure that we remember that as a leadership, we are here to help support individuals and not to add uncertainty and stress. I think also there's a negative aspect of it in the sense of the rationale supposedly for it is that it helps to support local government, it helps to support neighborhoods, roads, etc., work that's in local communities. But we do not have separate funds. Everything that's collected goes into the consolidated fund. So it's clear to me that it's going to support the deficit as opposed to really supporting local government. So we have to really look at what alternatives are. I would not be serving my country if I was here saying I disagree with it and I have no alternatives to suggest. So I'd like to go into those alternatives now. I see some short-term, medium, and longer-term alternatives for us. In terms of short-term, one, I think focusing on the strengthening of the Board of Inland Revenue. Again, I like that the Board of Inland Revenue is going to be strengthened. Currently, though, we do not necessarily need to wait for it to be converted to the Integrated Revenue Collection Service. The EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Institute, has said that there's so much leakage, that there's so much more that we can be collecting right now without having to necessarily further penalize homeowners and add that stress and uncertainty to them. So the EITI had said that when they started tracking the amount of revenue that was collected from quarry companies, in the 1 year that they started tracking quarry companies, in addition to the petroleum and other resource-based extractive industries, when they started tracking the quarry companies, the revenues collected went from $32 million to over $1 billion in 1 year in revenue collections from one industry. So there's so much leakage that can still be targeted even without us necessarily creating the new tax institute. Once we collaborate between sectors and we have transparency, we can collect a lot more. So that's one of the short-term mechanisms. Forgive me when I just check my notes. The other short-term mechanism was something I had referenced in my last contribution about the policy-based loans available from the international financial institutions, specifically the IDB and the Latin American Development Bank. We have the 0.3 billion available from Latin American Development Bank, which works out to about $2 billion TT. We have, over time, signed between 5 and 6 PBLs, policy-based loans, with the Inter-American Development Bank, which vary between about $150 million US to about $300 million US, in total accumulating to about $1 billion US, which is about $7 billion TT. Now, these are short-term. They're specifically for budget support. They are extremely beneficial in terms of interest rates. The institutions are, we are member countries of the institutions, and as stated before in the debate on the Latin American Development Bank, the institutions do not have a profit motive, so it's more like a cooperative for development. So the rates are always much more beneficial to go to these institutions than to the private sector. Also, there's usually a grace period, 2 to 3 years, so that this kind of allows us to have a bit of a break before we have to start repaying them. So these are short-term. They, in total, between the Latin American Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, is about $9 billion TT, and it's dispersed over several years, different tranches, 2 to 3 years usually. Now, this is a very short-term solution. It's not going to be something that we can continually be taking out loans for. So in terms of medium term, we have to really start looking at restructuring our economy, and not necessarily doing what we've been talking about doing for a long time, which is diversification, because diversification, the way I see it, is still very public sector driven. It's still very much about the public sector deciding there are these 7 sectors where we see benefits. It's really more about saying, how do we change the entire investment climate to make it more amenable for private sector to invest and for there to be benefits. So in terms of the current investment framework, we have these 7 sectors we've decided upon. And of course, there's some rationality there. The methodology has never really been explained, but we can all see that we have a comparative advantage in tourism products. That said, though, there have been other sectors that were added over time without any justification. There's recognition that it's better to have a strong investment climate. So it's not just about picking sectors and incentivizing those, but ensuring that any individual who has a comparative advantage in whatever their specialty is can then start a business and do well at it. So that's just a comment on the productive investment policies framework and the fact that we need to strengthen the investment climate. And that would be things like having efficient ports, the ability to register online, pay taxes online, making sure that services are really accessible to all investors. Second, the social entrepreneurship incentives is a massive area of potential for us as a country. There's 2 companies that are great examples of this. They're local companies, and they are really pioneering work in their field. The interesting thing about them is that none of them fall into the 7 categories of traditional investment incentives. So one company is Conflict Women, one company is Nourish TT. Conflict Women is a for-profit company. It is a social enterprise that helps support survivors of domestic violence, and it helps them with psychosocial support training as well as with entrepreneurship training. It helps them with making jewelry, which they then sell locally and internationally. Founded by Asiya Mohammed. And it has really been helping women to be financially empowered to help themselves survive on their own, as well as have access to training and mentorship and healing from trauma support. The other company that I'd like to refer to, Nourish TT, it's a registered non-profit. So it's interesting, one is a for-profit, one's a non-profit. We don't have a way that a company can register as a social enterprise in Trinidad and Tobago. So Nourish TT is a non-profit. It is very recent. They launched about 1.5 years ago, and they've done a phenomenal job. They take waste food or excess food from groceries that would otherwise be diverted to dumps, and they instead deliver to charities. It's all run through an app, so you can, if you're a registered charity, well, if you're one of the charities that works with them, you can go on and you can say exactly what your charity needs that particular day, and it helps to feed orphans and homeless people in Trinidad and Tobago. So there's several benefits. One, it's feeding people. Two, it's taking excess waste that would be going to dumps, and instead it's feeding. And it's reducing the number of trucks on the road. All the deliveries are done at night, it's efficient, and it has been, I think it's provided over 100,000 meals thus far. Very under the radar, very, very progressive, very grounded in serving Trinidad and Tobago. And recognizing, of course, there's a link between environmental as well as food, as well as service. So the interesting thing about these two companies is, as I said, they don't fit into any of these traditional investment categories. So they're not in tourism, yachting, marine, etc. These categories that we have defined as a country. But there are always companies that are going to be existing that are doing really good work, but that don't fit into these categories. So it's useful for us to think about, how do we incentivize social impact companies like this? So what I would suggest is that we, one, have a way that companies that are social enterprises can register as a social enterprise. And two, that there's a tax benefit to them. Whether they're for-profit or non-profit, they still have to pay taxes. Only registered charities don't have to pay taxes. Non-profits still have to pay taxes on receipts and income. So one, having the ability to register as a social enterprise, and two, once that social impact is measurable and recorded, then having a tax incentive to be able to incentivize further work in that field and then further benefits. This helps to reduce the burden on the public sector, because instead of the public sector financing dump trucks, food, trauma workshops, etc., now the NGO sector and private sector and social enterprise sector is really taking an active role in solving these problems that were traditionally considered public sector problems. So again, it kind of relates to this overall framework of how does public sector and private sector merge, and what kind of financial instruments can help to improve this relationship and this social impact. Lastly, I'd like to comment on the foreign exchange. The last debate we had on this was in this House in December. At the time, the foreign exchange rate was 6.78, the monthly average selling rate. Then in January, February, it went to 6.77, which was actually a decline. Very small, but a decline. The foreign exchange situation at the moment is not sustainable. So we can either choose to do something which is using a purely fiscal approach, or a purely monetary approach, or a mixed basket. A purely fiscal approach would say, okay, we are recognizing that the foreign exchange imbalance is due to a differentiation between foreign exchange demand and foreign exchange supply, and there's a public sector, i.e. a fiscal role in these imbalances. So a foreign exchange fiscal approach would purely be to wait for things to balance out. If we wait for things to balance out, it might cause more speculation and more speculative demand. A purely monetary approach would be to listen to what the University of the West Indies or the IMF is saying. They are suggesting that we depreciate to a rate of either 8.5 or 8.5 to 10, depending on which institution you read. Now, the advantage of this is that there will be an end to speculation, an end to speculative hoarding. The disadvantage would be, of course, a weakness in our economy. Looking at a mixed basket approach is what I would suggest instead. So in the 12 months leading up to December 2016, there was a very gradual depreciation of about 6% year on year. So, and the economy was able to absorb it. We would have noticed if the economy was not able to absorb it if there was a change in the inflation rate. There wasn't. So it's very likely that we can increase this gradual depreciation from the 6% where it was to, say, 7 to 8%. There's been no change at all from December to now. So we can do this gradual depreciation 7 to 8%, as well as integrate elements of a fiscal approach. So if we look at foreign exchange supply and foreign exchange demand, the foreign exchange supply is very difficult for us to do anything with on a short-term basis. It's not particularly elastic. Foreign exchange demand is where we can make a bit of an impact. If you look at the components of foreign exchange demand, the number one component of that is crude oil imports for Petrotrin. Again, I commend that there was an increase in crude oil production locally over the last 6 months from 50,000 barrels to 60,000 barrels. But if we're currently importing 100,000 barrels a day, then we can try and further change the tax regime to incentivize local production. And that hopefully can have a very short-term immediate impact on reducing foreign exchange demand that is used by Petrotrin for crude oil imports. So that would be a mixed basket approach of fiscal and monetary. And the last recommendation I have is just to reiterate public-private partnerships and social impact bonds, these innovative financial instruments for development. And there was one final. My final recommendation was just that the approach, again, really emphasize moving away from an implementation role towards a facilitation role and a regulatory role. So away from trying to be the ones behind every single project and every single initiative towards partnership with the private sector and the NGO sector. So that's it for my contribution today. I thank you all for your energy and your time.
Honourable Senators, I think it is an appropriate time to suspend. So we will take this suspension now and return at 5 p.m. And I just want to remind members of the need to have a quorum here at 5 p.m. when we resume. So we are suspended until 5 p.m.